the eve of World War I, the population of Platt and the surrounding villages numbered around 1,200 individuals. It was primarily an agricultural community. However, there was also a brickworks, paper and flour mills, and an established quarry. A new school had been built 2 years earlier, replacing the building that stood beside the church, which itself was built in 1843 and was the spiritual heart of the parish. Between 1914 and 1918, around 200 men from Platt, Crouch, Rootham Heath, Comp and Bastard saw active service in the military, accounting for almost 80% of the male population of the parish at that time. Many were volunteers and answered the call to king and country in the early days of the war. Some were reservists who were called back to the colours and sent to France and Flanders with the British Expeditionary Force during August and September 1914. By the summer of 1916, almost all the Platt men at the Western Front were concentrated in the Somme region of France. Peter Piper, a young private from Crouch, wrote to his sister on the eve of the battle.
My dear sister, I found some of our old mates here, so I'm not alone, but I have not found Tom yet. And I'd rather have my old feather bed than these tents, but still, I shall have to put up with it.
Peter was killed in action on the third day. The Pierces, another well-known local family, saw both their sons sent to the war. Frederick was the youngest of the boys and was also at the Somme.
One of his roles in particular at the Battle of the Somme that he told me about was the 7 days and 7 nights before the battle. He was out in no man's land, building bridges at night so that the troops could cross over when the pounding of the German lines stopped. And he was out there at night. Must have been frightening time with the shells whistling overhead, and occasionally he said one would fall short and explode not far away. That is why he was partly deaf for the rest of his life.
Albert Bowen ran away to join the army when he was just 17 and was among several men from Platt who attacked on the first day of the Somme.
He went out with a platoon to creep across no man's land to what had been their trenches before the Germans drove them out of it, because the telephone wires was all laid along the rim of the trench. And they had to maintain that, otherwise there was no contact with our army people, with their own people. Those wires being cut, they got no contact with one another. So this platoon went out to check and make sure that the wires were okay, the telephone wires, you know. And they got shelled and bombed on the way over. And my father was the only one who was left alive. And he stayed out there all night, laying along, working himself slowly along the edge of the trench at night. And all he could hear was Germans speaking in the trench right beside him. And he was telling me it was quite something to frighten the life out of him when he first heard them, but he got so used to it, he started to learn German. But he was out there all night until in the morning the army behind from the trenches where they'd been driven back to actually decided it was an attack so they could relieve him, get him back. Yeah. But he lay there 24 hours looking after this wire. We wouldn't do it nowadays. No.
Of those who were sent overseas, about a quarter never returned. And as the war rumbled on, telegrams from the War Office informing of the death of a loved one continued to arrive on the doorsteps of bereaved wives and parents, and were often followed by a letter of condolence from the fallen soldier's commanding officer.
Dear Mrs. Ingram, I'm sorry to have to inform you of the death of your son in action on the 8th of August. He was bearing himself magnificently, by all accounts. We are all very sad to know that he is now gone.
Dear Mr. Parish, it is with deep regret I have to inform you of the death of your son, which occurred September 13th. He was hit by machine gun bullets on an attack on that morning.
He was just one of the very best, quite fearless,
and absolutely trustworthy in the most hard and unpleasant jobs. It is the death of such a man that makes me, at times, hate the war.
On April the 29th, 1920, less than a year after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, a public meeting took place in a church room in Platt to discuss the possibility of having a local war memorial and honour those who had fallen. Nora Collings later wrote about her memories of the hall being built.
When I came to live in Platt in 1921, the Memorial Hall was about to be built with the money collected by the Platt people for a memorial to the local men who had died in the war. The roof was covered with roofing felt. The solid floor was covered with planks of wood. The tables were of similar shape and size so that they could be roped together to form the stage. There were only 2 toilets, a gas ring, a cold water tap and a small sink. The interior was heated by 2 large coke stoves, which nearly always worked badly. There was no cloakroom, and I think the WI gave the first curtains and also paid for a second-hand piano.
The opening ceremony of the Platt War Memorial Hall took place on November the 18th, 1922. A bronze memorial plaque, designed and manufactured by local resident H.G. Murphy, a major figure in the arts and crafts and deco movements, was unveiled on the north face of the building. The parish now had a centre for community activities, as well as a place to reflect on those who had lost their lives. In September 1939, Britain went to war with Germany once more, and the people of Platt were again called upon to do their bit. Unlike the First World War, the Second had a very palpable effect on the parish, with several incidents of enemy and Allied aircraft crash landing around the area.
So if there was a crash, I was there getting the perspex because I used to make models with it, carve out models in it, you know. And what they put in the aircraft is ideal because it's very thick. You can carve it beautifully. And what I do remember vividly is riding along on my bike, coming from Ruddermeath, coming back to Platt, and where the sandpit is now, where it used to be a chicken farm and everything, there used to be some horse chestnut trees growing down below a bank there. And of course I got by there and the Germans were starting to get a bit thick overhead. So I remember diving down there and laying on the bank underneath watching them, you know.
When it was the Battle of Britain, you know, when the Spitz was all up, I mean, we was playing in the orchard and Jeff, he come down into the orchard and made us go into the shelter, our friend's shelter, because he said, I mean, we hadn't took no notice, we heard all this pinging, and of course it was all the bullets flying about. So he shoved us in the shelter and told us to stay there until the siren gave the all clear. We never really, I say, took a lot of notice of it until the doodlebugs started coming.
We were woken up when the siren went, which was, well, woke about several counties, I would think. It was so loud. Scrabble out of bed, put on a coat and grab a pair of shoes or boots, Wellington boots, and scrabble down into the shelter, and then you'd hear the planes coming over and the doodlebugs came over, and you would wait for the engine to stop, and then everybody was sort of holding their breath until either it went on further or you heard an enormous crash when it hit the ground. And we all sat there and said a little prayer, just keep everybody safe, because it was horrendous. It really was horrendous.
The most deadly incident occurred during the night of the 16th of October 1940, when a stray German bomber loosed 16 high-explosive bombs over Rootham Heath, causing the deaths of 11 people at the Royal Oak Pub and Rootham Heath House.
When the bombs landed outside of our house, they blew up in all of the windows and caused lots of damage. You could still see holes in the front door from the bomb splinters. A lady called Hester McInnes was sitting by the fireplace and was killed by the blast. She was visiting her mum, and another lady called Olive, who lived here, died in hospital a few days later.
After the Second World War, 2 further plaques were added to the memorial, with the names of servicemen and civilians who had died through enemy action. At the start of the new millennium, the hall had been in constant use for 80 years and was showing signs of aging.
In 2001, following a public discussion, the trustees of Platt Memorial Hall decided that our hall was no longer fit for purpose, and the option of refurbishment was not viable due to the costs involved. So began the long process of looking for a site on which to build a new structure. Through long negotiations and after an option survey, we joined with Platt Primary School and purchased a section of this site, which was known locally as the Brickmakers Field, from Ryden Homes in 2012. The funding for the new hall came primarily from the sale of the existing site, as well as local donations, capital from Kent County Council and the Heritage Lottery Fund, who gave us money to relocate our war memorial, which is a significant part of this hall and is important for many residents in the parish and of course the history that it carries.
Work began on this aspect of the build in January 2016 and was completed at the end of May. The building of the new hall and relocation of the memorials has also allowed us to work with the children of Platt on a variety of projects and help them understand more about the world wars both nationally and locally and how they have shaped who we are as a nation.
I would say I would have liked to go on because if I was in my house and all of a sudden the air raid siren went off and I could have got bombed, I could have died, so I would say it was safer to go.
The First World War has now passed beyond living memory, and yet it is now a greater part of our national consciousness than ever before. Our goal has been to get to know the people commemorated on our memorials, to understand their lives and the sacrifices they made on our behalf, and to preserve that knowledge so that it is available for future generations, so that we truly never forget.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.